And Ahuva, if you, yeah, I see it.
And it's all yours.
It's mine, okay. Well, and I hope that you can see the slide and you can hear.
Yes.
Okay. Well, this actually is part 2 of our presentation because, you know, we needed to understand Zionism first. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to give you a very quick overview first about what we did in part 1. But today we're going to start with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, then a very important conference called the San Remo Conference in 1920, then the Avian Conference. So for all of you who are very fancy, when you drink Avian water, this is where the water comes from. Mm-hmm. Then the very infamous white paper from 1939. Then, of course, we're going to be getting to Truman, which was the person that essentially got the vote in the United Nations for partition. And we're going to finish with a very important person, Golda Meir, because in effect, she was the one that saved Israel after the partition. Well, as a very quick overview, what we said in part 1 is that the anti-Semitism that occurred all throughout Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years, 1800 years, essentially created Zionism. So whether it was anti-Semitism itself, whether it was religious persecution, or all of the economic constraints that the different countries imposed on us, that in essence created Zionism. Well, we also ended up talking about Theodor Herzl, who is quite correctly called the father of Zionism. But if you take a look at the dates of his birth and death, he died a relatively young person. So when he died in 1904, Chaim Weizmann picked up the baton from political Zionism. And so this is where we're going to take it, because Chaim Weizmann is the one that actually ended up doing just about everything. And if you can remember, he was the first president of Israel. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be my references for this part of the presentation is that these are 2 excellent books. One from Theodor Herzl himself called The Jewish State. He actually wrote it in German, the Judenstaat, and this is the English translation. And the other one is from Jack Tauber, A History of Zionism. So these are my references for this part of the presentation. Well, of course, Herzl was the father of Zionism. So all I wanted to make sure is that we all knew that Herzl actually became a real Zionist after the Dreyfus Affair. And I'm not going to spend any time on the Dreyfus Affair because we did it in the last presentation, but I just wanted to bring it up to your attention. And of course, the goals of Zionism was to establish both a religious and a political homeland for us. The other one is to encourage Jews to return to Palestine, to make Aliyah, and to reestablish Israel. At the time that the Zionists were discussing these things, they were talking about Judea and Samaria, which is the old map that we had from the combined kingdom. And the political Zionism, their main goal was to establish Israel as a nation among nations where other nations would recognize Israel. So that was the goal, the primary goal of political Zionism. Okay, so before we get into the Balfour Declaration, I'm going to give you my references, these 2 books. One that is by Jeff Lewis, called the Balfour Declaration, and the other one, which is an excellent book to hear about everything that was happening even before Zionism, called All Jerusalem. So these are my references for what we're going to be discussing now. As we said before, Chaim Weizmann became the successor to Herzl. And the reason why Weizmann became the most important person is that as a chemist, and he was, even though he was born in the Ukraine, as a matter of fact, but he went to England. And in England, as a biochemist, he came up with a method of making synthetic acetone. And that allowed the British to make smokeless gunpowder, because all of these raw materials up until that moment were coming from Germany. And of course, England was at war with Germany at that time. So Chaim Weizmann, when he came up with that, he became a tremendously influential individual. He became a very good friend of Arthur Balfour, and this is where we get the Balfour Declaration. At that time, David Lloyd George was the prime minister. The prime minister, through Arthur Balfour, became very supportive of the idea of a, I'm sorry? I'm sorry, somebody said something? Okay. David Lloyd George, through Arthur Balfour, became a very good Zionist. And the other person that had a great deal to do with the Balfour Declaration was Mr. Rothschild. And this is the Rothschild from London, because there were other Rothschilds in Europe, but Lionel Rothschild was very influential in the original Zionist. Well, here is Mr. Balfour and the Balfour Declaration. So let's read a little bit about what it says. I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations. So this was the, so this was the first time ever.
Can I suggest that somebody mute everybody?
Yeah, I just did.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. Well, at that time, one of the things that was happening during the First World War is that the Ottoman Empire was in decline. And as you can see in here, the Ottoman Empire, which is present day Turkey, actually controlled what became, or what was known as, Palestine. Arabia was sort of like a independent nation, but all of the other Arab countries were under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and they were essentially disappearing. And both the Allies, which is France and Britain, were actually winning against the Ottoman Empire. Well, after the First World War was finished, at the San Remo Conference, and this is very important, in Italy. As you can see on the left-hand side, there's this little town called San Remo. The powers that won, England, France, Italy, and Japan, got together and they said, how are we going to divide the territories that at one time used to be part of the Ottoman Empire? Excuse me. And as a matter of fact, if you see on the bottom there, you see the American flag. The Americans, we were at the San Remo Conference, but we only had status of being able to explain things, but we, the United States, did not have a vote in the San Remo Conference. Well, here is a picture of the winners of the First World War. As you can see all of the individuals. And if you notice, the United States is not there. Well, take a look at the San Remo Resolution. First of all, the San Remo Resolution, and we're going to take a look at what it says, was actually after the San Remo was accepted by all the countries, the 51 countries who participated in the San Remo Conference. It was adopted by the League of Nations. And if you remember, the League of Nations was the United Nations of that time. The San Remo Resolution said that we need to give Palestine, or we need to take Palestine and give rights to the Jews, and to have other Middle Eastern rights or countries, territories given to the Arabs. This was the first time in 2,000 years that 51 nations plus the League of Nations said that we deserved a homeland. The first time. Well, this is how it was divided. Syria became under the control of France, and both Iraq and the rest of Palestine, what they call Palestine, became under the control of the British. So one of the questions that people keep asking is, when the participants in the San Remo Conference, how can they give land to Israel or create a state? At that time, they didn't even know it was going to be called Israel. How can they give a territory to the Jews? What about the Arabs? Well, if you take a look, Syria didn't exist. Syria became a country. Iraq became a country. And the rest of it was the British mandate of Palestine. So the Arabs ended up with something like about 150 times more territory than what the partition was originally looked at by the San Remo Conference attendees. And this is, Chaim Weizmann was absolutely over the moon with this. He wrote a major paper, and at the bottom, I'm going to read it for you. Take a look at what Weizmann said, and he was giving this presentation at the Zionist Congress of 1920. This is the most momentous political event in the whole history of our movement. The movement is the Zionist movement. And it is perhaps no exaggeration to say in the whole history of our people since the exile. The exile, of course, was back in after the destruction of the Second Temple. Britain's foreign minister, Lord Curzon, said the San Remo Conference is Israel's Magna Carta. So this was the importance of the San Remo Conference. Well, after the San Remo Conference that took place and Britain got the mandate, they started appeasing everybody. And on the left-hand side in here, you can see El Husseini, that Britain appointed the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem in 1921. And as a matter of fact, they thought that the Grand Mufti, El Husseini, was going to calm the Arabs. The exact opposite occurred. And when Hitler got into power, El Husseini became the biggest Nazi supporter, to the point that once the Second World War started, El Husseini actually asked the Germans to establish concentration camps and extermination camps in the Arab countries. That was the appeasement by Great Britain. And of course, the Arabs started having riots and massacres. So as a result of that, Britain said, hey, look, what we need to do, forget about the Balfour Declaration, forget about what the nation said at the San Remo Conference. We're going to start discouraging the land purchases by Jews and immigration into Palestine. Well, now we go to 1938, and this is the Avian Conference. The Avian Conference was actually called for by President Franklin Roosevelt in the United States. And the idea was to get 32 countries to come in and discuss what is going to be the fate, what is the world going to do with the Jews from both Germany and Austria, because at that time, both Germany and Austria wanted to get the Jews out. Now, at that point, which is 1938, they would have allowed emigration, but absolutely not a single country would accept Jewish refugees, not one. And Chaim Weizmann, after having heard what was happening at the Avian Conference, he said the following: the world is divided into two parts. Those places where Jews could not live and those places where they could not enter. Well, then the infamous white paper of 1939 was put out by Great Britain. And this is at the worst time, because this was, if you remember, the invasion of Poland by Germany occurred in 1939. And this, at the beginning of 1939, in March of 1939, Britain put out this statement of policy, and it said the following: Britain will only allow a maximum of 15,000 Jewish immigrants per year to come into what was called Palestine. Not only that, but that 15,000 a year would only last for 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, any additional immigration, the Arab countries had to agree. And regardless of whether the Arabs agreed or whether the Arabs didn't agree, didn't make any difference what our population was in terms of its increase. Jewish residents in the protectorate could not exceed 1/3 of the population of Palestine. Now, Churchill, who was a very, very great supporter of Zionism, regarding the white paper, he got up on the House of Commons, and he said, this is a breach. This is a violation of the pledge that we made way back in 1918 and 1920. And this is the abandonment of the Balfour Declaration. So this is the end of the vision. This is the end of the dream. And this is just before Hitler started the extermination of the European Jews. Well, after the war, now we're talking about 1946. If you remember, the war actually ended in 1945. Jewish groups in Palestine started to attack the British forces to try to see if we can get some kind of a resolution, because Britain was still not allowing Jewish immigration even after the Holocaust. And in July of 1946, the whole world knew what happened in the Holocaust, because the Nuremberg trial, at the Nuremberg trial, the Nazis said that they had killed 6 million Jews. It came from the Nazis. Well, so one of the things that a group did is that they attacked the King David Hotel, because the British administrative headquarters were there. And this is what the results that you can see in here. And then, of course, in 1947, I'm sure that you remember what happened with the Exodus with the ship, that the British would not allow this ship with 4,515 Holocaust survivors to come into Palestine. Well, eventually, Britain said, hey, look at the Palestine is ungovernable. We cannot govern it anymore. We're going to give it back to the United Nations. So this is now going to be the problem of the United Nations. Well, Harry Truman, by this time, was the president. He was our 33rd president. I thought that it would be important to let you know, given what is happening in Ukraine and what is going on with NATO and so on. Truman was the one that actually established NATO. And Truman was the one that influenced the UN, the United Nations vote on partition. We're going to go into more detail in a second. And the other thing that I just want you to know is that after the partition, there was a number of months in which Israel had to declare independence. When Israel declared independence in 1948, Truman was the first country, through him, was the first country to recognize Israel 11 minutes after Israel Independence Day. Now, Harry Truman had a lot of troubles. So for those of you who want to go into much more detail, my references, what I'm going to tell you, comes from these two books. The one on the left is called Israel and the Legacy of Harry Truman. And the other one by von Busek, because one of the things that happened is that once Truman made the decision to allow the partition, and so the Jewish refugees can go into Palestine, he was an avid reader of the Bible, and he knew the story of Cyrus the Great. So he said, I am Cyrus, and that's the name of the book. Well, Truman had tremendous opposition to the partition. And I'm only going to show two important American politicians and bureaucrats. One is George Marshall, which was the Secretary of State at the time, and the other one was Jane Forrestal, which was the Secretary of Defense. They kept saying to Truman, do not accept or do not vote in favor of the partition, because we're going to have a problem with the Arabs. The Arabs control the oil, and we need the Arabs, so do not vote for partition. Well, there was, according to Truman's own autobiography, they had a meeting. One last meeting, he wanted to hear what these two guys had to say. He says, okay, Mr. Marshall or General Marshall, what do you say? Do we vote for partition or we don't? And according to Truman, Marshall said, Mr. President, the Jews have the Bible, but the Arabs have the oil. Well, Truman didn't know what to do. And then he got a phone call. Again, this is from, it's all referenced. He got a phone call from his ex-partner, who was Jewish, Mr. Jacobson. So Eddie Jacobson asked Truman if he could come and see him in the White House. And Truman said, okay, you can come in with one consideration, one condition. You cannot tell me anything about the partition because I don't want to hear about it anymore. Nobody is in favor. Well, Eddie Jacobson came in and sat down, and the story is that Truman said to him, it says, well, remember, you cannot talk about the partition. Well, according to Truman's own autobiography, Eddie Jacobson started crying. And I'm sorry that, forgive me if I use a four-letter word, but since Truman didn't mince words, so I'm going to use his words. He said, Eddie, you son of a bitch, you know I cannot see you cry. What do you need? And Eddie Jacobson said, it's not what I need, it's what we need. We need our own homeland. And Truman went home, and in 2 days he thought about it, and he says, I am going to vote for partition, even though everybody in the country is against it. Well, the partition took place and the state of Israel was there. They were now accepting refugees, but they hadn't declared independence. The partition took place at the UN in 1947, and the state of Israel became, the Declaration of Independence happened actually today in 1948, in May of 1948. So what happened from the time that there was a partition until Israel declared independence? During that time, they had practically no weapons, and they knew that all the Arab countries surrounding them were going to attack them, and they had no weapons. So David Ben Gurion picked Golda Meir because she spoke English perfectly. She grew up, even though she was born in Kiev, in the Ukraine, she actually grew up in Milwaukee. So they sent Golda Meir to raise money to get weapons. And this part of the presentation, my references are, again, two books that I highly recommend. One is the autobiography of Golda Meir called My Life. And the other one, a name that was given to her, The Lioness, Golda Meir and the Nation of Israel. Well, Golda Meir came to the United States, including Miami Beach, by the way. And the story is that in the two places where Golda Meir raised the most money, number one was New York and number two was Miami Beach. They thought that it would be an absolute dream if she would raise 25 million. She actually ended up raising 50 million. And with those 50 million, the state of Israel was able to buy weapons of all places from Czechoslovakia. Because at that time, not only was the United States in favor of Israel, but so was Russia, so was the Soviet Union. And the reason why the Soviet Union was in favor of the state of Israel being formed is that they thought that, which was actually true, at the very beginning when Israel was formed, it was a socialist state. So they wanted to have a socialist state in the Middle East and to get rid of Britain from Palestine. So Golda Meir not only raised the money, and with her money is where we got the weapons to pay for the weapons from Czechoslovakia, but she also traveled secretly to Jordan. She had spoken many times to King Abdullah, and she went to Jordan. She went to Amman. Now, King Abdullah wasn't too happy of having a woman talking to him, but he said, okay, I'll let you come in. According to Golda Meir, she reminded King Abdullah that for many years she had been talking to him, and he said, we will never attack Israel. We would never attack. But at that time, it looked like they were getting ready to attack, including Jordan. So Golda Meir came to King Abdullah and said, you told me that you weren't going to attack, but that you're mobilizing your troops. And she says, well, all the other nations and all the other Arab nations are putting tremendous pressure on me. There's nothing I can do. And then he said to her, he says, look it, don't declare independence. Wait a little while. What's the hurry? And take a look at what she said to him. We have been waiting for 2,000 years. Is that hurrying? Well, and here is Golda Meir as one of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence from Israel. And that is the presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Let me see, I saw a hand, somebody already had. If you have a question, you'd like to make any remarks, if you pick up your
Everything
hand.
very beautiful and very well
Rebecca?
presented.
Thank you.
Everything was very well presented, Dr. Michael. Everything was perfect.
Yes, I agree.
Thank
Even though we have heard, bits and from over the years, but it's nice to have everything together in a beautiful. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much.
I want to say that the original, it was an excellent presentation, by the way. The
Thank you.
original of the letter that he signed approving the formation of the State of Israel is in his museum in Independence, Missouri, which I saw.
That's right. In Independence, Missouri. That's correct.
Dr. Michael,
Yes,
it's good and short. That was good and short. And also, I've been to Independence, I live very close to Independence. So I went there and I visited the museum and I saw the movies and I saw everything what happened over there.
Mike, hi, it's Pixie. I just wanted to say thank you, and thank you for giving us the titles of all the reference books, because it's something that we can all look forward to picking up at the library or the bookstore or
You
wherever.
read about it, right?
And it was wonderful. So I really, Bill and I both appreciate that.
Thank you.
That's very nice of you, Pixie.
Well, I mean it.
I'd like to make a comment if that's okay, Michael.
Sure.
On the slide you had where we were discussing in 1938 about how no country actually wanted to take in the Jews. There was one country that did take in Jews, and does anybody know what country that was, so that they were
Santo
able to?
Domingo. Santo Domingo.
The Dominican Republic.
Right.
China.
Oh, that I didn't know. Well, is it that they accepted, or the Jews actually traveled into?
I don't know. I don't know all the details, but I do know a few thousand or a couple of thousand Jewish refugees. I think some even had gone there just before the war broke out. And I know Shanghai was a safe, or at least a temporary safe place haven.
Before
But
the war,
again,
yeah, before the
It
war.
actually wasn't China. It was the Japanese consul general to Lithuania. He was Japanese.
yeah.
His name was
Correct.
Sugihara. And what he did was he was a tremendous humanitarian. And any Jew that came to him, he offered him a visa. So with that visa, the entire Mir yeshiva of 2,700 people, their students and their families, escaped across the Soviet Union and then down China and stayed in Shanghai, which is at the time was under the control of the Japanese. So it was actually the Japanese. By the way, Sugihara, there's a very famous story that he was, as he was forced out, he was fired because he refused to listen to Tokyo. And he was fired. And on the train leaving Lithuania, the Jews were standing on the train station chase, and he was just signing blank pieces of paper and throwing them out the window for the Jews to fill in their names. They were blank pieces of paper. He died in obscurity, a poor man, because he returned to Japan broken and dishonored. His children were honored at Yad Vashem about 10 years ago, or maybe more, where they accepted his humanitarian award that's given by Yad Vashem for the righteous Gentiles. It's estimated that he saved around 14 to 16,000.
Yeah, I've actually read about this man, but you're saying he's the one responsible for getting the Jews to Shanghai.
Right. So it wasn't that China accepted them as much as it was really a Japanese thing, and it was only one man.
So just so you know, Temple Menorah, that's Rabbi Perlson speaking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
we recognize it, Rabbi.
I know you do, but there are some people here that are not from our
Recognize,
temple, so I just want to make sure that they know.
But I also thought maybe you guys know, I thought it was Costa Rica accepted Jews or allowed Jews.
I know that the Dominican Republic, they officially accepted the Jews that came in. So, while in Cuba, it was not they were not allowed in the Republic, in the Dominican Republic. They opened up the doors for them, and you know.
There
Yes,
was,
and actually the story on the Dominican Republic is that Trujillo,
Mhm.
in the middle of the country, out somewhere, in the sticks, he had a very large farm. So he accepted a number of Jewish refugees and essentially put them there. So the Dominican Republic was the only country officially who was able to,
Accepting.
yeah.
I
Right.
guess he originally allowed 100,000, but only a few thousand came. And they went
Oh,
to
really?
Suva. They
Oh,
went to Suva.
can you tell us a little bit more about that story?
Yeah, and well, there's several Dominican Jews that live here. Well, I guess most have come from that group. However, if you still go to Sosua, which is in North Beach in the Dominican Republic, you will find there's a synagogue there, and there's a museum with a list of all the members of the group that came to, excuse me, to that city. So if you ever go to the Dominican Republic and you go to the north part of the country and the beaches, it's right there. Sosua is called.
What
Yeshua.
about Guatemala? I thought that Guatemala accepted Jews.
I don't know.
Okay,
The Jews all over, the Jews all over Central America. Some
But-
countries have more. Guatemala has more Ashkenazi than Sephardim. On the other hand, Honduras only has very few families. So does Nicaragua. Costa Rica has also more Ashkenazi than Sephardim, but yet Panama has more Sephardim than Ashkenazi. Colombia has, I think, about probably also more Ashkenazi,
Mhm.
with a large number. Venezuela the same.
But that was afterward. Afterward. It was not at the point where the Jews were fleeing from Europe. That was after the
Well, many of them came before the war. Just like,
when it came before. It was
just like they came to Cuba.
right.
Michael, did some Jews also, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't some Jews also try to go to Cuba, or what was the story with Cuba at the time?
Well,
That last time.
yeah, we actually had a presentation on that. There were 934 passengers who were allowed to go into a ship called the St. Louis. And it was going from Hamburg, Germany, into Cuba. The passengers, they were all Germans. They thought that they actually had valid visas to go into Cuba. And by the time that they ended up in Havana Harbor, they found out that those visas were actually fake, that that wasn't the case. And there was a corrupt Cuban official who took their money, charged them a tremendous amount of money, gave them the visas, but they were not visas. They were actually only for, to remain in Cuba for a few days as tourists. So that particular ship stayed in Havana Harbor for a number of days. Cuba asked it to get out. The ship actually ended up parked out here, right outside of Miami Beach. The United States would not allow it to go in. Canada would not allow it to disembark the passengers. And so eventually they actually went back to Europe, in which most of them, except for the ones that ended up in England, they actually perished during the Holocaust. So Cuba did not accept them.
So no one wanted. So no one wanted to accept the Jews. That was the basic message.
No,
Right.
This order apparently came from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I just want to tell you that on the 50th anniversary of that event, 1989, I participated together with the members of Temple Menorah and other temples. A group of individuals purchased what was left of the private jet of Hitler, and that was brought to Miami, and it was sunk right where the ship was docked.
really?
Yes, which was a couple of miles out from the Fontainebleau. So there's a whole, I'm sure there was plenty of video on that event. Maybe Rabbi Perlson may have been involved in that event.
Rabbi, are you all familiar with that?
Yeah, but it actually, I came in 1989, so that actually, I didn't have anything to do with
Yeah,
it.
for
It
that,
already
yeah.
been,
Rabbi
They
Remo,
already
I think,
been,
was far with it.
yeah,
Yeah,
those
I
be-
personally
before I
participated.
was here.
It was, who was a group, I think one of them was, at the time, I think was mayor of Miami Beach, Resnick, Abe Resnick, together with a group. I think even Jack Chester was involved in that one. So they went ahead and brought and bought whatever was left and sunk as a coral reef.
Interesting.
Interesting.
I can tell you because I was there, so
Yeah, I
Mm.
didn't know that.
I lived through it and I have videotapes of it.
Really?
Yes.
Well, maybe, with the rabbi's help, you might be able to get us all so that we can all see it.
I have to look like because it's a few years old. So I hope it was converted to video. It was filmed, and that was already video. So let's see if it's in good condition and if it's interested.
Interesting.
Parts of it.
That would be great.
Very interesting.
Wow.
Well,
Yes.
I was wondering about the San Remo conference. As far as what I knew was that was the point where there was really a betrayal especially to Weitzman, and what he had done for the British. And it wasn't exactly that they agreed with the Balfour. Yes, they agreed with the Balfour, declaration, but with no date or time or when is it going to be. And for the time being, for Israel to be under the British mandate until they found it okay or good time for Israel to give Israel or the Palestine to the Jews. So it wasn't exactly accepting, the Balfour Declaration as it was when they sat down to divide their loot, if we may say so, their areas, their countries that they have captured. The Jews were kind of like put aside at that point. That was really
Okay. The Balfour Declaration was actually became part of the conference proceedings. The big difference in the San Remo Conference is that for the first time ever, a group of nations actually agreed that there was going to be
That's what I'm saying. They
Yeah.
agreed to something that really they did not have to sign on and say, this is it,
Right,
now it's going
right.
to happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
The thought of the British was that this land would never be able to hold more than a certain number, a very minimal number of people. I don't think 500,000 they were talking about, whatever, that there was desolate land and there was no way the land would feed these people or have water for them. And between the Arabs and the Jews, they're going to kill each other and it's never going to happen. So it's kind of like, I don't know how to compare it to, but it's like, yeah, it's yours. We're going to give it to you. Yeah, we agree that it's yours. But you know what? We'll wait a little bit and maybe it's not going to be yours because you're not going to be able to handle it.
well,
Kind of thing.
you're absolutely right. And if you were to go from the San Remo Conference to the white paper, what Britain was doing at that time, it was telling the Jews, you are going to get the land, and they were telling the Arabs, you're going to get land.
That's
And
exactly
it was
what
exactly
happened.
the same land, absolutely right.
Exactly, that's absolutely what happened.
So
Yes,
they were promising the same land to two different
exactly,
people.
exactly, absolutely, right.
Michael, I think an important lesson to be learned here about why we have a state of Israel is because of the friendship between Eddie Jacobs and and our former president. Excuse me. Because most individuals are not aware that the relationship started that Harry Truman was a bank teller, and Eddie Jacobson had a business, and he would go see Harry Truman every day at the bank. And after a while, he invited him over to leave the bank and come with him as a partner in the store. The store failed, but they continued to be friends.
That is correct. They had a haberdashery store.
Mhm.
But in any case, in addition to that, for years and years before that, Truman was very sympathetic to the Jewish cause. But everybody in the American government and all of the other allied nations were telling Truman that we're going to have a problem with the Arabs, so don't do it. We need their oil. And remember that in 1946, 47, and 48, this was the beginning and the height of the Cold War with Russia.
Right.
Right.
There is a video of Eddie Jacobson's daughter speaking at an AIPAC conference, telling the whole story.
Wow.
And a lot of what was done at the beginning was, excuse me, was done in Eddie Jacobson's house before really you had a formal consulate and ambassador and everything else. So the business with Israel in the United States went through his house.
As you're talking and you're saying this thing of everything that happened between Jacobson and Truman and everything else, if this was a movie by Hollywood, nobody would believe the plot. Absolutely, it's absolutely unbelievable what happened.
The power of friendships.
Yeah. Well.
Okay, anybody else?
No.
So thank you, Michael, again for a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're looking forward to the third one, right?
Yes.
Michael was incredible. I learned so much. This is Rebequita, okay? So
That's a big.
Well, thank you very, very much, Roz.
Laila Tov and Chag Sameach,
Laila
everyone.
Tov, Rabbi.
Chag Sameach.
Well,
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Rabbi
Bye.
Phil.
Thank you.